Thank you very much, Alice. Moving over to the opposition then. Our second speaker in opposition tonight is Dr. Richard Johnson. Dr. Johnson is a senior lecturer in politics at Queen Mary University London. He has written widely on the Labour Party history and is co-authoring the forthcoming book, Keeping the Red Flag Flying, the Labour Party in Opposition since 1922. Dr. Johnson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's an honour to be with you tonight. When I was an undergraduate at this university, I was in this very chamber the night of the 2010 general election as I saw the terrible results roll in and the sad end of 13 years of a Labour government. Here we are 13 years later, and it feels that soon this chamber may bear witness to a slightly different set of results. And yet today we are being asked to debate the legacy of a Prime Minister who has been dead for over a decade, whose premiership ended 33 years ago, and who became the leader of her party 48 years ago. Such is the hold of Margaret Thatcher on the collective imagination of our nation. Conservative Party leadership contests regularly descend into Thatcher Tribute Act auditions, and much of the Conservative Party are fully signed up to the Thatcher cargo cult. But it should also be said that for the left, there is a tendency, a compulsion even, to see Thatcher as a uniquely wicked politician who set out all to destroy that was good about this country. And in this reading, there is nothing that can be good that can be said about her. I can remember once describing Thatcher to my left-wing grandmother as a humble grocer's daughter. There was nothing humble about her, my grandmother rebuked. There was a posh shop. It was the Harrods of Grantham. Even now, I feel this instinctive revulsion to everything that she and her governments stood for. And when the right hear this, I think they get a little thrill, a sense of excitement about it. But I want to suggest that this is a problem both on the left and on the right, because the Thatcher that we can all conjure in our minds, whether that's as a heroine or as a villain, is a myth. She was never real. We have all succumbed to a caricature, one that was partly of Mrs. T's own making. Mrs. Thatcher is typically presented as a woman who fundamentally changed Britain and a highly effective politician. And yet I think this gives her far too much credit. It downplays the importance of the context in which she operated, the inheritance of previous governments, as well as changes that were already taking place within the Conservative Party. Moreover, it overlooks the role of contingency, chance. This kept Thatcher afloat in a way that was not predestined. I have a letter my grandfather, who was a Labour councillor, wrote in the 1970s saying, this woman isn't going to last long. Finally, and I think this is uncomfortable for the left sometimes to admit, that actually there was a lot that Thatcher didn't change. In many respects, I would argue that Thatcher failed on her own terms. On the left, we've always learned to love to hate Margaret Thatcher. In the 1980s, the Labour deputy leader, Denis Healey, called her the great she-elephant, the Catherine the Great of Finchley. The socialist president of France, François Mitterrand, rather mysteriously said that she had the eyes of Caligula and the mouth of Marilyn Monroe. Less elliptically, the Labour backbencher Tam Dalyell denounced her in the House of Commons as a bounder, a liar, a deceiver, a cheat, and a crook. When she died a decade ago, Thatcher could still invoke these harsh sentiments. As MPs delivered their tributes to her in the House of Commons, the Labour MP Glenda Jackson stood up and denounced the heinous social and economic and spiritual damage that Mrs. Thatcher unleashed on Britain, and at one point even denied that she was a woman. While Jackson's eulogy raised hackles from Conservative MPs in the chamber, I actually don't think Mrs. Thatcher would have minded that much. The divisiveness was part of her style. That meek prayer of St. Francis that she delivered outside Number 10 in 1979 could not be more inappropriately chosen to describe her own approach to government. For Margaret Thatcher saw the world in Manichaean terms. She would ask, is he one of us? This is what we believe. The enemy within. She was defiant, bold, scrappy. The Labour MP Donald Dewar observed that Margaret Thatcher thrived on being heckled in the House of Commons. I'm glad that's not happening to me right now. She was immensely helped, he said, by interventions on the other side of the House. Without the spice of confrontation, she could struggle and run flat. So to her supporters, the myth is of this great humble grocer's daughter who defied the old-school ties Tory establishment, served as the longest Prime Minister of modern times, crushed the trade unions and the Argentines, privatised the commanding heights of the British economy, created a generation of first-time homeowners. As her admirer David Cameron said, perhaps he wouldn't have said it a few years later, she made Britain great again. To her critics, she was an ideological fanatic who believed that there was no such thing as society, who sold off the family silver, who saw unemployment as a price worth paying, whacked up regressive consumption and poll taxes, gave huge tax breaks to the rich, eviscerated the welfare state, reoriented the British economy far too much to the City of London, destroyed working-class communities in the regions, ended local government in the big cities, gave succor to the apartheid regime in South Africa, and rolled back advances for gay and lesbian people. Now, there is much truth, perhaps in both of them. I side more with the second analysis, but the point is that both of these concede too much to the legend. They present Thatcher as this woman of great agency and of effect. But this downplays a whole variety of factors that we need to take into account. First is contingency, is luck. Thatcher herself became leader by accident. She was put up as a stalking horse against Ted Heath. You couldn't do votes of no confidence with letters to the 1922 committee in 1975. You had to put someone up. And so the viable challengers, the Willie Whitelaws, the Jim Pryors, Geoffrey Howes, they didn't want to be the ones to wield the knife. Thatcher volunteered herself as the sacrificial lamb. And to her credit, it was too late before they realized what they had allowed to happen. The second thing I think this downplays is the muddle and confusion and dithering of her political career. She wasn't as committed to her ideas as we sometimes think. She was this great champion of grammar schools who was education secretary close more than any other education secretary. When she was Prime Minister for 11 years, she did nothing to really roll back comprehensivisation. Third, she made errors of judgment. She lost her nerve on occasions. The circumstances of her departure from Downing Street, she has created this myth that this was treachery with a smile on its face by her cabinet ministers. But in reality, she had beaten Michael Heseltine in the challenge by 52 votes. She only needed 2 more to see him off completely. And she lost her nerve. She pulled out, even though she said she would fight to win. Fourth, she sometimes put British interests in harm's way. She wasn't this great effective geostrategic player. Let's take her so-called shining moment, the Falklands War. Narratives of this conflict lionize Margaret Thatcher as the steely or iron leader of great conviction. And yet the invasion was almost certainly partly a consequence of her own inept leadership. Thatcher, the supposed Cold Warrior, spent the first years of her premiership slashing the defence budget. In the 1970s and 1980s, the UK government paid for a naval ship, the HMS Endurance, to patrol the Falklands. A month after Galtieri became the dictator in Argentina from a coup, Thatcher ordered the Endurance back to Britain. She left them unguarded when the Falkland Islanders pleaded with her not to do so. Jim Callaghan, the previous Prime Minister, told her she was making a grave mistake, and three months later, the Falklands were invaded. In general, her approach to politics was more bark than bite, even on Europe, and this seems strange now. She was criticised by the Labour Party for not standing up to the European Economic Commission enough. Barbara Castle, the leader of Labour's MEPs, accused Thatcher of being willing to nag but afraid to fight. I offer this solidarity to Margaret Thatcher. For heaven's sake, stand firm, and I will back you up. One Labour MP said, "The truth is the Iron Lady shows signs of metal fatigue." So when looked in this light, Margaret Thatcher shares, I think, quite a lot in common with the modern-day Conservative Party. Like this government, there's a lot of talk, not a lot to show for it. Once you start to realise that the Iron Lady shtick was mostly a mirage, the less attractive features of her personality emerge. This House doesn't need a new Thatcher. When you look past the myth, it is clear that the bankrupt politics of the old one are still with us today.